The roar of incoming engines did not startle the Marines of the 6th Defense Battalion. It was the sound of inevitability. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the temperamental, high-demand, Army-developed SCR-270 radar set had done its job. It gave the men on Midway Atoll the precious minutes they desperately needed. Lieutenant Colonel Harold D. Shannon's gunners were already at their posts, the barrels of the 3-inch anti-aircraft weapons pointed skyward. When the first wave of Japanese bombers appeared, the air above the island exploded into a chaotic, lethal geometry. One participant would later describe the resulting melee as a furious 17-minute action. The heat radiating off the gun barrels was instantaneous, baking the humid air around the emplacements. Gunners sweated corrosive rivulets into their eyes, momentarily blinded by the muzzle flashes. The sound was not a continuous blast, but a terrifying, grinding symphony. There was the high-pitched whine of approaching Val dive bombers. There was the heavier thump-thump-thump of the 40mm Bofors guns, spitting 120 rounds per minute. And there was the deeper, concussive boom of the 3-inch shells cracking open the sky. Shell casings, hot as branding irons, rained down around the sandbagged pits. Corporal Harold Hazelwood, who had already endured the shock of the December shelling, moved with a practiced, desperate speed, feeding the ravenous weapons. The gun crews worked as one frantic organism, tracking the diving planes, adjusting for lead, and maintaining the rate of fire until the recoil mechanisms were screaming in protest. Shrapnel screamed in the air above the trees. Japanese ordnance began to find its mark. Smoke, greasy and thick, billowed upward from the fuel storage area and the aircraft hangars. The island, a tiny, sandy spit supporting a vital airfield, was shuddering under the assault. But the Defense Battalion held. They were a shield, designed specifically for this moment, and they inflicted a steep price. They claimed the destruction of 10 attackers in that initial wave. But the fight was far from over. As the Japanese aircraft withdrew, leaving behind a sky stained with cordite and burning wreckage, the Marines immediately switched roles. They were gunners 1 minute, and damage control teams the next. They scrambled to clear the wreckage, put out the spreading fires, and repair the bomb damage, all while knowing the enemy carriers were still out there. The Imperial Navy was simply readying the next strike. The 6th Defense Battalion, facing the full fury of the Imperial Air Armada, was the ultimate test of a pre-war idea. But to understand how these men were prepared for such a moment, we must look back. The seed of this defense had been planted years before the first bomb fell on Midway, in the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the Navy Department in Washington. The necessity was simple, driven by the geometric expansion of the Japanese Empire. America's vital Pacific outposts, Wake, Midway, Johnston, Palmyra, were impossibly vulnerable. They were isolated dots in an ocean of blue. They were indispensable refueling and staging points, yet easily seized by any dedicated assault. The U.S. military's internal planning, codified in the color-coded War Plan Orange, identified the necessity of securing these garrisons. This conclusion was reinforced by Admiral Arthur J. Hepburn's 1938 board. General Thomas Holcomb, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, saw not just a strategic need, but a political opportunity. Amidst the isolationist sentiment that dominated the late 1930s, the idea of increasing the size of the Marine Corps for offensive action was a non-starter. But defense, securing American territory, that was palatable. Holcomb shrewdly advocated for the creation of specialized defensive units, leveraging the Corps' pre-existing doctrine of base defense to secure both vital funding and increased manpower. The resulting organizational blueprint, hammered out by planners like Colonels Charles D. Barrett and Lieutenant Colonel Robert H. Pepper, defined a unique combined arms force. This was not merely an infantry regiment. Each 900-man battalion was organized potentially with the material weight of a regiment. It consisted of 3 seacoast batteries, 3 anti-aircraft batteries, ground machine gunners, and specialized maintenance and administration teams. They were designed to be expeditionary coast artillery, capable of defending against both naval shelling and aerial raids. The technology they were assigned was a chaotic mix of the ancient and the utterly new. They trained on 155mm guns that dated back to 1918, but they also trained on the emerging science of early warning. The Marines were among the first to receive the temperamental Army-developed radar sets, the SCR-268, and SCR-270. These devices were so complex and demanding that they required operators who were young, wide-awake, intelligent men to keep them running and interpret their ghostly, flickering signals. First Lieutenant Robert D. Heinel, Jr., drafted the classified documents outlining the capabilities of these nascent units, preparing them for a war that had not yet begun, but felt increasingly inevitable. By the time the danger reached a fever pitch, the first battalions were already taking shape. They were deployed rapidly across the immense theatre. One defense battalion, surprisingly, set up radar and weatherproofed Nissen hut camps in the exceptional cold of Iceland. Another battalion anchored the exposed sea routes to Australia and New Zealand from American Samoa. Even Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, was secured by a 3rd Defense Battalion before it shipped out for effort.
The units were formed, equipped, and deployed based on foresight, not reaction.
But it took the trauma of December 7, 1941 to truly test their mettle. That Sunday morning, the air raid sirens on Oahu caught the Marines of the defense battalions by surprise, but not entirely unprepared. Within 6 minutes of the attack, 8 anti-aircraft machine guns were in action, their barrels traversing wildly to track the Japanese planes sweeping low over the installations. Eventually, 25 machine guns opened fire. They claimed the destruction of 3 aircraft during the initial fighting, a small yet significant victory in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. Yet, the limitations of the new units were also brutally exposed. For the 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, the heavy ammunition remained stored on shipboard, locked away from the hastily deployed batteries. The shells did not reach the gunners until after the second and final wave of attacking aircraft had completed its deadly work. A few days later, on a speck of land 2,000 miles to the west, the 400 Marines defending Wake Island faced the same existential crisis without the benefit of a single radar screen. They relied entirely on optical equipment to spot the relentless air attacks that began on December 8. Major George H. Potter's batteries, armed with 5-inch coastal defense guns, were the only things standing between the island and the Japanese invasion force. On December 11th, the defenders proved the value of expeditionary coast artillery. They repelled the initial assault, sinking Japanese vessels and sending the enemy reeling back into the Pacific. It was a stunning, if temporary, victory. But the shells for their 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, like those in Hawaii, had arrived too late. The fight was a testament to resilience, but without reinforcements, and without the crucial early warning radar, the defenders were overwhelmed. They surrendered on December 23rd. The brutal lessons learned at Wake Island and Pearl Harbor hammered home a single, inescapable truth. Static defense was a death trap. The Marines needed the tools to see the enemy coming, and they needed to be everywhere at once. The Corps responded with furious speed. By the close of 1942, 14 of these defense battalions were operational. They were the unheralded foundations, securing critical staging points from the bleak, sandy spits of Midway all the way to the rocky hills of Guantanamo Bay. This effort set the stage for the pivotal, bloody shift from desperate defense to aggressive offense. The furious 17 minutes of the Midway raid had ceased, but the noise that followed was deafening. Secondary explosions ripped through the air, steam lines hissed, and a deep, hungry roar signaled uncontrolled fire. For the Marines of the 6th Defense Battalion, the adrenaline crash was immediate, replaced by a consuming, heavy fatigue. They were coated in sweat, dust, and the metallic, acrid stench of spent cordite. The air was not clear. It was thick with greasy, black smoke billowing from shattered fuel storage tanks and aircraft hangars, completely obscuring the horizon. The weary gunners dropped their tools of war and picked up the shovels and axes of disaster relief. They were instantly transformed into firefighters, medics, and laborers, scrambling across the bomb-damaged atoll. They worked with desperate intensity, understanding implicitly that their fight had only been the overture. The Japanese carrier fleet was still out there, bruised and smarting, but still capable of launching a second, more devastating strike. The Defense Battalion had held the line, claiming 10 kills and proving the viability of expeditionary coastal defense. Yet the island itself was grievously wounded. They cleared wreckage, patched communications lines, and moved anti-aircraft guns into newly prepared positions. All of this work occurred while the strategic fate of the entire Pacific hung in the balance, decided hundreds of miles away by the unseen duel between the carrier fleets. When the news finally filtered back, starting as fragmentary reports, but growing into the monumental realization that the Japanese carrier force had been utterly broken by the American naval response. The exhausted Marines knew their sacrifice had mattered. They had secured the base, ensuring the critical Midway air and refueling station remained firmly in American hands. The 6th Defense Battalion then settled into a long, quiet vigil. Forged in that single, decisive battle, the unit developed a distinct identity, remaining on the island as a constant, reliable shield for the duration of the war. Midway had validated the defense concept, but it had also exposed a critical weakness, the lack of dedicated mobile ground defense. Every Marine, from the radar technician to the 90mm gunner, had to be prepared to drop his specialized station and fight as an emergency infantryman against a major landing. The Marine Corps moved instantly to correct the fatal flaw. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox approved the creation of separate infantry battalions, units specifically tasked to serve as mobile reserves for the defensive garrisons. The subsequent expansion was immediate and dynamic. New battalions were formed quickly, often equipped with a chaotic mixture of old and new weapons. The first 155mm guns were World War I relics, but they were rapidly being replaced by modern types. Crucially, the older, less potent 3-inch anti-aircraft weapons were giving way to the formidable M1A 190mm guns. The manpower demands were immense, forcing the Corps to take a significant racially complicated step. The 51st and 52nd Defense Battalions were created, manned by African-American Marines who served under white officers. This move reflected both the prevailing segregationist policies of the 1940s and the desperate need for specialized manpower. These segregated units were trained for the same complex combined arms defense, destined for the same anonymous vital duty across the vastness of the Pacific. Soon, the strategic focus shifted violently, moving from merely holding isolated dots to aggressively seizing them. The new island-hopping strategy, known internally as the Solomon's Ladder, demanded that the defense battalions become less static and far more adaptable. They now had to move immediately with the advancing front lines to secure newly captured beachheads and airfields. Their next great test arrived at Guadalcanal. In August of 1942, the 3rd Defense Battalion landed in support of the 1st Marine Division's brutal assault. The landscape was a humid, sensory shock. A stretch of beach gave way to acres of straight-lined coconut groves, fields of head-high kunai grass, and jungle-covered foothills that seemed to steam under the oppressive equatorial sun. Any appearance of calm was swiftly shattered by 6 long months of relentless Japanese counterattacks. The Marines set up their anti-aircraft positions in what quickly devolved into a grueling green nightmare. This was a war not just against the enemy, but against the environment itself. Biting ants swarmed their foxholes, and the air was thick with the constant threat of disease. Malaria, jungle rot, and malnutrition were constant companions, made worse by subsisting only on monotonous canned rations. The bitter slogan, "A tabrine to the last drop," became a daily reminder of the battle against fever. Colonel George F. Good Jr.'s unit realized their improvised anti-aircraft and ground defenses were necessary targets. They stuck out like a sore thumb. Yet they were the essential infrastructure, the protective bubble that enabled the bloody infantry assaults. They defended the perimeter, protected the nascent airfield, and kept the vital supply lines open. Enduring the psychological strain of prolonged garrison duty, they were deployed for the long haul. First Lieutenant Donald T. Reagan, operating the complex, single-digit serial number SCR-268 radar, felt the immense weight of their responsibility. Their duty remained largely unseen by the world outside the jungle perimeter. They were, as he reflected, doing quite a bit to protect those who were doing the more public fighting. The air raids over Guadalcanal were a constant, violent reality. The Defense Battalion gunners, utilizing the newly deployed M1A 190mm anti-aircraft weapon, learned quickly to track and destroy incoming Japanese aircraft. This weapon fired a massive 23.4-pound projectile. They operated as a sophisticated protective machine, a combined arms team capable of deploying searchlights, radar, and heavy artillery in concert. This constant aerial threat drove a crucial evolution in Marine Corps doctrine. In February of 1943, a dedicated radar board was formed at headquarters, standardizing the complex procedures for plotting, filtering, telling, and warning. Radar became a complex, highly secret discipline. It was a complete mystery to the uninitiated, but a demanding challenge to the newly minted technicians. Secrecy surrounded the entire operation, transforming the young men who ran the flickering scopes into a dedicated elite corps. The defense battalions had fully transformed. They were no longer the static coast artillery units envisioned by the 1938 planners. They were dynamic, combined arms forces, capable of enduring the relentless pressure of the Solomons. They fought off 121 raids on Vella Lavella, where the Marines' 90mm guns alone downed 46 enemy aircraft. But for the men stationed on the outlying islands, the deadliest threats were often boredom and loneliness. As the front lines pushed relentlessly further west, the war seemed to pass them by completely. They remained the anchors, the vital staging points, but the feeling of being stuck in the backwash of war led to fragile morale. Junior officers sometimes pleaded with their commanders just to get into the war and out of the endless defense duty. Their existence, however, was the absolute foundation for every single American advance. One defense battalion relieved another at Guadalcanal in January 1943, immediately taking over the infrastructure of defense. Later, a second defense battalion under Colonel Norman E. True landed on Tarawa in November 1943. They endured 19 Japanese air raids between November and January, securing the bloody beachhead for the major offensive push into the Gilberts. The defense battalions were the necessary rear guard, the vital, specialized units that absorbed the enemy's desperate counterattacks. They protected the airfields from which American air power projected its reach. They secured the bases that became the crucial stopovers for the long grey convoys heading westward. They were the hard-worked, frustrated species who ensured that the war could continue to move, island by bloody island, toward Japan. This strategic reality meant the Marine Corps defense battalions could not afford to be stationary. The war was moving too fast, too far up the Solomon's ladder, leaving behind any unit that was not mobile, adaptable, and aggressive. The true threat was no longer the battleship on the horizon, but the bomber wing sweeping in from the west. This realization caused a profound, almost revolutionary shift in doctrine, championed most fiercely by the unit known as the Fighting Ninth. They made a strategic gamble. They would completely abandon the traditional heavy coastal defense mission. The slow, static 5-inch guns were useless against fast aircraft. The real requirement was mobile fire support for the infantry and a dense, protective anti-aircraft screen over newly seized airfields. The Fighting Ninth was tasked with securing Rendova, a critical staging point for the push onto New Georgia. Their mission was immediate and aggressive: establish a protective umbrella over the landing area. The landing itself was frantic. The humid air of Rendova, thick with the smell of diesel and freshly cut jungle foliage, pressed down on the men as they landed. They were trading the relative security of a permanent garrison for the chaos of the front lines. Gun crews immediately wrestled the M1A1 90mm weapons into hasty, improvised emplacements. The Marines were still digging in, sweat plastering their uniforms to their skin, when the air became a deadly thoroughfare. The Japanese response was swift, the first wave of enemy aircraft sweeping low over the nascent defensive perimeter. The defensive order was not for the heavy artillery, but for the smaller, faster weapons. A team manning a Browning M2 water-cooled anti-aircraft machine gun opened fire. The high-pitched thump-thump-thump of the heavy 50-caliber rounds was immediate and sustained, tearing into the leading Japanese aircraft. It was a precise, desperate act of defense, and it worked. The plane spiraled, trailing smoke, and tumbled out of the sky. This was the first enemy aircraft downed at Rendova. The kill was credited to the humble, reliable M2, not the massive, slow-to-train coastal guns of old. The Fighting Ninth did not stop there. They pushed across the water to New Georgia itself, abandoning the pretense of pure defense for the brutal reality of offensive support. Their mission now included direct ground combat. They deployed their light tanks, machines originally designed to fight across open European fields, now battling through suffocating jungle, mud, and suicidal counterattacks. Using 37mm canister rounds, these tanks became specialized jungle-clearing tools. They fired directly into the foliage to strip away the jungle-concealing Japanese bunkers, transforming their armor into mobile fire platforms for the embattled infantry. The defense battalion was no longer just a shield, it was a spear tip. The next crucial step up the ladder was Cape Gloucester, New Britain, in December 1943. A new defense battalion landed directly behind the assault waves, tasked with immediately establishing the defensive perimeter that would hold the gains. New Britain was a sensory assault. The heat was suffocating, and the terrain was utterly hostile, defined by jagged ridges and cliffs jutting dragon-tooth crags, bare and black. There was no time to wait for the lines to stabilize. The beachhead was a monument to destruction, a 3/4 square mile junkyard of shattered equipment and pulverized earth left by the preliminary bombardment. The men of this battalion were immediately thrust into their dual, grueling role. They were laborers in the morning, wrestling heavy 40mm Bofors guns and fire control equipment off landing craft and dragging them through the mud. They were infantry at night, digging foxholes and fighting off infiltrators. The overriding objective was the airfield. It had to be secured, defended, and operationalized for the next phase of the offensive. The defense battalions were the indispensable transition force, taking a piece of conquered, smoking ruin and transforming it into a functioning American base. They were the ones who ensured that the aircraft could land, the supplies could flow, and the front lines could keep moving. As they established the radar posts and zeroed the anti-aircraft guns, they endured the isolation, the monotonous food, and the primitive living conditions that characterized garrison life. They were often frustrated, feeling that the main war was passing them by completely. Yet they were the essential foundation, the protective bubble that absorbed the enemy's desperate counterattacks, ensuring that the airfields were safe for American air power to project its reach. They were the anonymous, specialized infrastructure that made the island-hopping strategy viable, securing the bases that became the crucial stopovers for the long grey convoys heading westward, preparing the way for the next, even bloodier assault. The relentless pace of the island-hopping campaign left absolutely no room for static defense. The victories at Midway and Guadalcanal had secured the rear, but the new front lines, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, were impossibly distant. The Marine Corps Defense Battalions, now fully transformed into adaptable anti-aircraft artillery units, became the indispensable foundation for this staggering advance. They secured each captured territory and turned it into a forward staging point. The movement was a constant blur of logistics and deployment. Units were constantly moving, splitting into detachments, trading out World War I-era 155mm GPF relics for the modern mobile pedestal-mounted 155mm guns, and then later the M1A1 Long Tom guns. The older 3-inch anti-aircraft weapons were wholly replaced by the potent M1A 190mm guns and the ubiquitous M140mm Bofors. The Bofors guns fired 120 rounds per minute and would eventually be credited with half of all enemy aircraft destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. The sheer scale of the operation demanded immense manpower, forcing the Marine Corps to look beyond its traditional recruiting base. This necessity led to the creation of the 51st and 52nd Defense Battalions. These units were manned by African-American Marines trained at Montford Point, commanded by white officers. Their creation in 1942 was a complex moment, reflecting both the prevailing racial policies of the era and the absolute need for specialized, disciplined troops to secure the growing empire of captured islands. For the men of the 52nd Defense Battalion, the war was a study in sustained, anonymous vigilance. They were shipped first to the Gilberts, the penetration into the outermost ring of Japanese defenses, and then onward to the Marshalls. Their duty was not the dramatic, televised assault, but the grueling, essential aftermath. They were the ones securing critical atolls like Majuro and Roy Namur in Kwajalein Atoll. The preliminary bombardment of Kwajalein had been so intense that pillars of greasy smoke billowed upward for days. When the specialized battalion arrived, the landscape was a smoking, pulverized ruin. Their immediate job was to transform this devastation into a functioning American fortress. They immediately set up anti-aircraft defenses. This meant installing the new SCR-584 radar sets. These complex electronic eyes provided automatic target tracking, linking directly to the potent M1A1 90mm guns. The constant threat was palpable, even during periods of relative quiet. They endured the isolation, the monotony of canned rations, and the ever-present psychological strain. They knew the Japanese might launch a desperate, long-range attack at any moment. For the Black Marines, there was an added layer of frustration. They were highly trained, specialized technicians. Yet, long stretches of their deployment passed where actual combat continued to elude them, despite unceasing preparation. They were often detailed to dual roles. They served simultaneously as highly specialized gunners and essential laborers, digging and building in the humid tropical heat. Then the battalion received urgent orders for Guam. The island had been recaptured in the summer of 1944. While the major fighting was over, the job of turning Guam into a massive forward base was just beginning. The Marines landed and immediately began the arduous process of establishing their new perimeter. They worked under the direction of commanders like Colonel Leach, setting up the defenses that would anchor the American presence in the Marianas. The work was relentless. They hauled the massive Sperry 60-inch searchlights, capable of projecting a beam 20,000 yards across the ocean. They wrestled the heavy gun barrels into their firing positions. They were the essential logistics and defense backbone, protecting the vast infrastructure being built. This vital infrastructure, the airfields, the supply dumps, the hospitals, would support the decisive push toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Then, one moonlit night, the silence was violently shattered. Radar picked up incoming bogies, a desperate high-altitude Japanese raid. The gun crews snapped immediately into action. The air raid alert transformed the quiet island into a place of furious, directed violence. Coffee, famously thick enough to eat with a fork, went cold instantly in the mugs. The men tracked the targets through the complex fire control systems. On command, the 90mm guns roared. The smell of cordite hung heavy, immediately displacing the sweet, humid scent of the tropical night. Gun flashes illuminated the faces of the crew, young men from every corner of America, working in perfect, focused coordination. They fired 54 rounds before the ceasefire order was finally given. The enemy planes had been driven off or destroyed by the defensive wall of flak. In the aftermath, as the smoke cleared, the white infantry Marines who had been watching the spectacle approached the gun crews. They were exhausted, relieved, and deeply impressed. One white Marine, his voice raw with adrenaline, stated simply that he had never been so glad to see black people in his life. This was the quiet, critical work of the defense battalions. They rarely received the accolades of the assault troops. They operated in an environment where the deadliest threats were often boredom and loneliness, interspersed with moments of absolute terror. Yet their presence was the guarantee of success. They provided the anti-aircraft defense, the coastal watch, and the specialized technical expertise that secured the hard-won gains. Their ultimate, unseen contribution was to the final, decisive moments of the war. As the specialized unit maintained its vigil on Guam, other battalions were pushing even further forward. The 17th Antiaircraft Artillery Battalion secured Tinian, the final staging point before the projected invasion of Japan. On August 6, 1945, the men of the 17th watched from their posts. They saw the Enola Gay take off from North Field, Tinian. They had secured the base from which the ultimate offensive power was launched. A final, unheralded testament to the vital, dynamic role of the Marine Corps Defense Battalions in securing victory in the Pacific. The final, successful adaptation of the Marine Corps' specialized units was made official in the spring of 1944. The name Defense Battalion had become a historical relic, tied to the static, isolated coast artillery concept of 1938. The brutal reality of the Pacific War demanded something faster, lighter, and wholly focused on the sky. The units were formally redesignated as Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalions. This was a bureaucratic confirmation of a profound strategic evolution. The Marines of these battalions were no longer just static garrison troops. They were the indispensable shield that had to move with the speed of the assault waves. They were the ones who secured the beachheads and protected the engineers building the airfields. Most critically, they provided the dense, protective flak barrier that allowed the U.S. Navy and Air Force to project power across the vast distances of the Pacific. Their operational reach, once stretched from Iceland to Samoa, now followed the logic of island hopping, pushing ever closer to the Japanese home islands. They landed on Peleliu, where the 155mm long tom guns provided fire support for the infantry. They were assaulting ground described as the most heavily fortified square-yard-by-square-yard Marines had ever faced. They were on Okinawa, the final objective before the projected invasion of Japan, where the threat attained an unprecedented savagery. Here, the defensive battalions faced the ultimate technological and psychological weapon, the kamikaze. The Japanese air attacks were no longer tactical raids, They were suicidal missiles aimed directly at the heart of the fleet and the base infrastructure. The anti-aircraft gunners, utilizing the advanced SCR-584 radar and the rapid-fire 40mm Bofors, fought a war of pure attrition against pilots who refused to deviate from their target. Yet the ultimate unheralded contribution of these units would take place on the island of Tinian, captured in the summer of 1944. The specialized battalion, which proudly proclaimed itself one of a kind, landed on Tinian. They immediately began the arduous process of turning the island into the largest airfield complex in the world. Their mission was not to win the island, that bloody work was done, but to guarantee its security. They were the anonymous insurance policy for the final act of the war. The air on Tinian was a constant, deafening roar. Northfield stretched out, a colossal expanse of concrete and steel, perpetually filled with the metallic scent of aviation fuel and the smell of hot oil. The Marines of this unit endured the same mix of frustration and relentless labor that had plagued their predecessors. They were the hard-worked and frustrated species. They were often burdened by the dual role of laborers and infantry, subsisting on monotonous food and primitive living conditions, even as they manned the most sophisticated fire control systems in the Pacific. They set up their defensive arc. The 90mm guns were positioned to hurl their 23.4-pound projectiles miles into the sky. The 40mm batteries stood ready to chew up low-flying intruders. The powerful Sperry 60-inch searchlights stood sentinel against the moonlit nights. They were defending not just an island, but a profound secret. They were the silent guardians of the B-29 superfortresses, the massive silver aircraft that dwarfed everything else on the base. The Marines painted humorous signs on their makeshift barracks, wry acknowledgments of their isolated existence. They dubbed their home the Shady Acres Rifle and Gun Club. They endured the endless days of heat and the exhausting alert drills. Their job was relentlessly simple: intercept any plane, Japanese or otherwise, that strayed into the restricted airspace above the critical base. The officers were meticulous, keenly aware that Tinian was the key staging point for missions of unprecedented importance. The culmination of their vigil came in the suffocating pre-dawn darkness of August 6, 1945. The air above Northfield was thick with the smell of high-octane gasoline. Every Marine of the 17th Antiaircraft Artillery Battalion was at his post, the complex web of radar and gunnery teams humming with focused tension. They had watched countless B-29s take off for bombing runs against the Japanese mainland, but this morning felt profoundly different. There was a palpable weight in the air, a hushed reverence among the flight crews, and an almost unbearable sense of waiting among the security perimeter. The Marines watched as the Enola, a B-29 that had been the subject of quiet, intense scrutiny, taxied slowly down the runway. The four massive engines roared, a sound that vibrated not just the ground, but the chests of the gunners watching from the perimeter. They tracked the plane visually as it picked up speed, a silver giant lumbering down the black ribbon of concrete. The Anti-Aircraft Battalion was the final, indispensable layer of defense between that plane and any possible threat. Their presence guaranteed that no desperate Japanese reconnaissance flight, no last-ditch kamikaze, no sabotage could interrupt the mission. The Enola lifted off, climbing heavily into the morning sky, carrying its unimaginable payload. The roar of its engines faded quickly, replaced by the normal sounds of the base, the distant clatter of trucks, the rhythmic sweep of the radar dishes. The gunners secured the base, cleaned their weapons, and went back to the monotony of garrison duty. They remained unaware of the exact nature of the weapon launched from the runway they guarded, but they had done their job. They had secured the vital outpost, protected the infrastructure, and enabled the successful prosecution of the war to its ultimate, decisive end. Their legacy was found not in the bold headlines of assault landings, but in the simple fact that the airfields remained open and the supply lines remained intact. From the bleak sandy spits of Midway to the concrete expanse of Tinian, these specialized battalions provided the critical anti-aircraft and coastal defense. They transformed captured ruins into operational fortresses. They were the essential, often overlooked backbone of the Pacific Campaign, securing the foundations that made the entire offensive structure possible. Their unheralded service was, in fact, absolutely indispensable to victory. Many who served felt a profound sense of honor, knowing it was an honor to have served in a special unit of the U.S. Marines. They were the shield that allowed the sword to strike. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.